Yeah, we're you guys ready?
Yeah. We don't have any dollars,
We're gonna get started. We're gonna get started.
you know, that Mark began and introduced it.
I'm gonna start because
I think we have one, I think everybody in here knows our longtime SCL presenter and men's ministry presenter over the years. And I'm delighted to have all of you here. So let's give Mark a welcome and he can.
thank you. Thank you for all that she does. I mean, this wouldn't exist without her. So
And the team are
thank you. Yes, and the
Especially
sound
out
booth.
there.
Yes, thank you.
and then Jody's part of our team and Julie Christensen, who's down visiting granddaughter. So
Yes,
we got a great team.
you do. And Jody, yeah, Jody, take it out.
When he walked in, I'm gonna. Let's see if I can
30 years. John keeps calling me up every December. January must be Mark. So I always say yes, because such a great group. It's good to be with you guys again. And yes, it has been. I'm probably over 30 years. I've been coming here.
Yeah, singles were before that.
The singles were back when I was single, right?
Yeah.
Right, we were all single.
We're still single.
Some of us single again, you know. Yeah, those were the days when I owned Harley Davidsons and did all that stuff. I'm going to tell you a story today. It's 30 years old, so we'll get to that in just a second. So let's start with a prayer. Lord, thank you for allowing us to gather together this morning in this beautiful place. We want to study the Bible and understand how to be more like Jesus. So please, Lord, bless the words that I say and bless the ears that are listening. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. Amen. Yes, we're going to talk about first a little bit about marriage. So that means we're talking about power struggles. So, and I'm going to get deeper into the psychology of power struggles and what the Bible has to say about that. But first, let me explain marriage to you.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, there's a guy by the name of Harville Hendricks who's written a book called Getting the Love You Want. He's actually a pastor. He's been on Oprah 17 times, so he must know what he's talking about. And his idea is you pick the partner that gets you to the deepest part of yourself. You do it unconsciously. There's something about the person that you pick that resonates with you, and you go, that's my guy, or that's my girl. You don't really know why, and you explain it to your friend and say, that's my guy, and they go, really? Because they don't get it, and they don't get what you get. You know, there's an unconscious resonance that happens between the two of you. So you unconsciously pick the person who's going to perfect you. Now, you don't know that, but you can pick up on it by the way they stand, the way they laugh, what they think is funny, what they like to read. And actually, just looking at them, most of us pick up these signals. Are called mirror neurons, where something in your brain mirrors something that's going on in their brain, and you just kind of know. You feel like you've always known them, right? This is a sense that we get. We call it chemistry. We call it limerence in psychology. There's this falling in love thing that's powerful. Without it, we probably wouldn't get married. So it's real, and we try to understand this chemistry that happens. Now, what this means is, if you're going to pick the perfect person who's going to get you to go to the deepest part of yourself, maybe they remind you of unfinished business you have with a parent. There's something about them that's going to get you to the deepest part of yourself. That means that you pick the perfect person to make you more angry than any other person on the planet. No one else can get to that deepest part of you like this person can get to. And then you have a choice to make. You can say, this is too hard, I'm out. Or you can say, I'm going to figure this out because there's something that I need to fix in me. And I pick this person who's going to help me perfect me. Now, some of you just flat out make mistakes, and that's okay. I mean, you got to get out of a mistake, right? But all of us pick someone who's going to perfect us. And it means it's going to be hard work. So the really good marriages are hard work. Although I did hear this morning, someone said that his parents survived marriage because they just never talked about anything, and that's how their marriage survived. Because they knew that if they did, they'd get into it, right? There's something that would get you to the deepest part of yourself and make you angry. So it's important for us to understand, number one, why we fight. You've been triggered by this person that gets you to the deepest part of yourself, and you're going to automatically fight with them more than anybody else. People come to me for marriage counseling and say, I get along with everybody else, but I fight with her all the time. I say, that's called marriage. Of course, you do. John Gottman, who studied marriages all around the world and is the foremost authority on marriage, says 70% of the time when people fight in marriage, they don't solve it. 70% of the time. And 70% of the time, there isn't a thing to solve. So he says when they fight, he's looked at it and he's counted it and he's measured it. He said, people fight about children and money and sex and in-laws. And you want to know the number one thing people fight about? You ready? The number one thing they fight about? Nothing. There isn't a thing. There's no thing there. They're just fighting. Because the last conversation I'm not done with, and the thing you did this morning, I'm still mad about. And last week you didn't, do something that really made me mad, and I'm just ready. You're just ready. 70% of the time when they fight, there's no solution to it. So why are people fighting? They're fighting because they feel disconnected and they want to feel connected. I don't feel connected to you. I don't feel you got me. I don't feel you got my back. I'm not connected. So strangely, what we don't want is agreement. You think you want agreement. Now you're fighting because you want connection. You want to feel like someone who gets me, because 70% of the time you're not going to come to agreement anyway. That's just, we just fight about stuff that doesn't, it goes on and on and on. It's the same conversation. The facts are just different. Just keep having the same conversation over and over. So once you get that, then you realize, okay, I'm not really fighting because you said you're going to be here at 8 and it's now 9. That's not really, that irritates me. But what I'm really fighting about is I want to feel like I can trust you. And if I bring it up, you say, I'm sorry. You guys we can talk about it. You're with someone that will help your life make sense, help you make sense. So let me talk about this falling in love thing. Talk about my wife who's here today, Barbara, and my daughter, Brianna, over in the corner. I didn't know they were coming, but I was going to tell the story anyway. So they've heard it. And some of you have heard this too, because I've been around. I've been here for so long. I used to, we're members up at Bel Air Presbyterian, and 30 years ago, it was a big church, 30 years ago. And I used to give lectures there from time to time too. And I was standing out in front of the church, single. I was 30 years ago single, and this huddle of guys came out of the church, and they're going down the hill. And in the middle of them was my wife Barbara, and they're all just kind of trying to get her attention and see if she would talk to them, And as she approaches me, I just felt it. I said, I have to talk to that girl. There's something about this girl. I should be the guy trying to talk to her. And as she walked past me, I couldn't speak. I had nothing to say. She got away. They all went down the hill and got in their cars and left. And so I showed up next Sunday, planted myself in front of the church. I go, she's not going to get by this time. No Barbara. I went the next week. No Barbara. I went for 3 months. I had the best attendance of anybody at that church. Standing out in front of the door there, waiting for her to pass. She didn't show. So I cornered one of those guys in that group, and I made him tell me what her name was. So at least I knew her name, so I was prepared. Right. Well, I was there so often that they said, well, why don't you get a job? And teach the singles class. I go, okay. So they gave me a job because I was there every Sunday anyway. So I was there to teach a single class, and there was like 250 people there. It was a big class. Yeah, it was huge. And so I'm there, I'm ready to speak, and through the door comes Barbara, and sits right in the front row. And I don't even know what I talked about. Do you remember what I talked about? I have no idea what I said.
Are people basically good or basically bad?
Was that the talk? Right. I had no idea what I said. But at the end of the class, I planted myself by the door. She wasn't. And as she got past me, I knew her name, which kind of freaked her out a little bit. Thought I was stalking her, but I got her to go out with me. It wasn't easy, but I did. And so on our first date, by then, I wasn't young, even 30 years ago. She says to me, well, how come you've never been married? She says to me, that's a great question on your first date, kind of sorting things out here, right? And I said on our first date, because I've never met anybody I wanted to marry until tonight.
Wow.
She's still here. She had to get home early that night because that really did freak her out. Like, real. It took months, but she eventually said yes, and now we got 3 kids, and the best decision I ever made. So I believe in it. This limerence thing, this thing that happens, and it's somehow you don't know why you know, but you know. And I'd already had a PhD in psychology, and I knew all this stuff about communication. None of that mattered. The heart wants what the heart wants, right? So some of you have made decisions to get into relationships, and because of this same feeling, and I'm telling you, it's powerful, it's real. I think it's from God, this limerence thing, this chemistry, this knowing. But also, you need to know what it means is you pick someone that's going to get you to the deepest part of yourself that's going to be harder than anybody else to live with. They're going to make you angry. You're going to have power struggles. You're going to fight to perfect yourself. You think you're fighting because they need to learn something. You're not. You're fighting because you need to learn something. There's something in you that's not quite finished, and you pick someone that, if you say yes to it, can help you finish that. Barbara and I are both from families with 6 kids, and we were each the kid that spoke up to our dads, right? We're the ones that, fought back, with our dads. So what do you think our first few years are like, right? Exactly. So you're in it, and you're going to have power struggles, and you're going to fight. Now, we all fight differently. Some of you are the ones that speak up. Some of you are the ones that don't speak at all. That's how you fight. There are different ways to fight, but we're all having some kind of power struggle. So today, what I want to talk about is why do people stay in relationships where someone is controlling? That kind of power struggle. Some of you were in relationships for decades where someone was controlling. Maybe you are now. Maybe you're the controlling person in the relationship. But why would someone want to control someone else? Because they do, and I think there are reasons for it that we're gonna try to open that up today. As you know from last week, my view of power, when I talk about power struggles, is on a continuum. So that we have different kinds of power. On one end, we have the power of control, physical control. You can physically dominate and control. That's a kind of power. People who are Batman, Superman, those people who can beat up anybody in the room or outsmart them, that's control. On the other end of the power continuum is people who have authority. And people who have authority then inspire others. These people make you do what they want. These people get you to want what they want. So this is inspiration. This is more spiritual form of power. This is empowering people from within. This is controlling them from without. Now, there's a time for both. It depends on the context. What kind of power do you need? If someone is invading your country or your house, you need the power to force them back. You need to fight back physically sometimes. But over here, though, in relationships, this kind of power doesn't really work very well in our interpersonal relationships. We need to get better at inspiring people to want what they want. One of the biggest problems we have in dealing with veterans who come back from some service, they're all very good at this. They know how to fight, and I thank God for them that they're out there defending our country, right? And then they come home and then they beat up their wives, and so it's a big problem. They don't know how to have a different kind of power when they come back. We need to be versatile. We need to understand the context. So power has a context. What does the context need? What do we need in this context? What kind of power is needed? What form of power? Many authors call this force and this power, but you get what I'm saying: control and authority, or domination and inspiration. There are different kinds of power. As I told you last week, people think of Superman and Batman as powerful, but that's this kind of power. And then those people think of Jesus as benign. Yeah, right. Right. He's changed more lives than anybody in history, by far. Not even close. More people followed him and his teachings today than anyone else on the planet, by far. That's benign? I don't think so. There's a kind of power, the power to inspire, the power to change you from your heart outward. that is transforming. This is transactional, this is transformational. So different kinds, they're both power. Jesus did this too, you know, he did miracles and he made the water calm when the seas were raging. So he did this too, but he also knew this. So we need to understand the versatility. And it's a mistake to think that this is evil too, although it often is used for evil, controlling other people. It's just a different context. You know, Hitler, for instance, he only knew this and he tried to dominate. But after World War II, we did studies in the United States to try and understand, well, why would the Nazis do that? Not just Hitler, but why did the people who followed him murder all those Jews? Millions. How could they stand there and gas them and murder them? We wouldn't do that. Americans would never do that, right? Those are just Germans that would do that. So Hannah Arendt and other social psychologists actually studied this, and they went over there and studied it. She wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem. I don't know if you...
The banality of evil.
Is that right? The banality of evil. She found out that they were all terrifyingly normal.
Yeah.
That was her phrase for that. Terrifyingly normal. And then we did replication studies, obedience studies in the United States with Stanley Milgram and the Stanford prison experiment. We did those studies here in the United States. And what we found is we would do it too. We did studies where when they asked psychiatrists ahead of time, how many Americans would, if we did a study pretending to teach someone, but they were shocking them to get them to learn, how many Americans would shock people to death if they were just told to do it? You know, psychiatrists said less than 1%. We would never do that. You want to know what percent of us did it? 66% of us did it. People just like you. So if I ask for a show of hands, how many people would shock somebody to death? Nobody's going to, well, maybe one of you would raise your hand. Yeah, not a particular person, any person. Yeah. Someone you don't know. Would you shock them to death? And the study shows 66% of the people in this room would do that. Isn't that shocking? So this is a kind of power, and we all do it, and we're all susceptible to it, but we just need to be wise. When is it a time for you to be controlling? When is it a time for you to be inspiring? When's a time for force? When's a time for authority? And it's not so simple as to say this is all evil, all military is evil. It's not that simple. It's not that simple. So we want to be wise in our understanding of what power means. So let's talk about controlling relationships. Think of people you know. Now, this isn't just about marriage. You know, you can it can be in a church setting, it can be in a business setting, it can be in any setting with someone who seems to need to dominate and control, right? Why would they want that, and why would you go along with that? You know, if you were in, maybe some of you were in a relationship for decades with someone who's just controlling you, and we think back and wonder what the heck was I doing? Well, I think there is a way to understand that. Now, psychologists have studied this for a long time. Let's read a verse that's very unpopular for most women in marriages. It's Ephesians 5:21 and 23. I'm going to read the first verse is 21. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And there's a paragraph. And the beginning of the next paragraph is, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Yeah. Why do I only hear a yeah from a man? Why? Did I read it again, or you don't want to hear it? Read about the husband. It's supposed to be loving. That's right. I'm leaving that part out. All right. Isn't that upsetting? Especially because most people don't read that first verse that I read. They start at the paragraph. The paragraph is, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands. They start there. But in Greek, there don't have paragraphs. The paragraphs and even the verses are put in by way later by help me out, priests, you know, who are riding on their donkeys and they were losing their place, you know, so they put in the verses so they could catch their place. But the Greeks, they just wrote it out. There was no period. They just, you know. And here's a shocker for you, men, sorry. This verse that says, wives, submit yourself to your husbands. The word submit in the Greek isn't even there. Not there. It's a technique they use in Greek. What the writer, Paul, was doing is he was referring to the word submit from the previous paragraph. That's where the verb is. It's not in this sentence that I just read. So that you would know the most important verse is the first one that I read. And the priest put the paragraph there. There's no paragraph break there. So the really important verse is submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's the real point of the verse. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he goes on to, he's sort of like making an analogy, telling a story like I just did. And let me give an example of that. So he gives an example. But the key verse is what we call mutual submission. That's what the paragraph, that's what it's about, as you would to Christ. Now, in psychology, we make a distinction between surrender and submission. Now, so don't get too hung up on the actual word itself, because I think really what he's talking about here is surrender. I'm explaining what that means. He's really saying, for you to live well in life, you've got to figure out how to surrender. And who you surrender to is not your spouse, by the way. Who you surrender to is Christ. You surrender to something bigger than you, something greater than you, something that's going to make you better. And I have news for you, it's not your husband. There's something bigger out there and better and empowering that has the authority to transform you. And that's what you submit yourself to. You surrender. In psychology, we call that surrender. Submission is, in psychology, what we say is a substitute for surrender. That psychologically, we believe we are all looking for something great enough for us to surrender to give our lives to, something to live for that empowers us to be all we can be. And if I can find that thing to surrender to, it will help me figure out who I am. Now, there's no human being that's going to do that for you, right? So you don't surrender to another human being, you surrender to this greater thing, to Christ, in the presence of another human being, but you don't surrender to the human being, because they're never going to give you what you're looking for, right? But it's somehow that process of mutual surrender that we figure out who we are. That's what I was saying earlier. The real test of power struggles is for you to solve something about yourself. How can I be all of who I am if I don't find this thing to surrender to that's greater than me? And that surrender, when it manifests itself in a relationship, is something that you both do. You can't, only one of you can't do it and have a really intimate relationship. A really intimate relationship is when you both do that. You're surrendering to Christ in the presence of each other. Your vow that you made in marriage, you vowed to each other before God. It was God that's going to empower you to keep this thing that we call a promise to each other. And so when we surrender, what are we surrendering? I surrender to God so that I can be a more powerful person in my relationships. What is it that I'm surrendering? In psychology, we say what you're surrendering is your false self. We believe there's a way of talking about people where you have a true self and a false self. The false self is kind of the ego. Yeah, you could call it, sometimes we call it ego, the thing that you present to other people that looks good. You dress up and you look good, and it's a good thing we do that. You're probably glad that I dressed up today. You wouldn't want to see me how I was last night, it's not pretty. So we present this sort of false self, and it has its utility as long as you know that the false self is false. It's the thing that you present to navigate through social encounters. And I think this is what Jesus is talking about when he says, whoever wants to be my disciple, they must deny themselves and take up the cross daily and follow me. There's a lot in the Bible about denying self, right? That's what he's talking about. You got to deny that selfishness, the ego, the part of you that wants what it wants, right? You got to figure out how to surrender to something bigger than yourself in order to really live a more authentic life. And Jesus said it's a better life too. You're going to find yourself much, much more influential. I know I've mentioned this several times, but Dostoevsky has written a very famous Russian novel about this Christ-like figure that's completely transparent. Prince Mishkin, yeah, college student over here, right? Okay. Okay, all right. Let's go. And the whole novel about how he transforms everybody's life by being so transparent, by being so vulnerable, so open. Do you remember the title of the book?
The Idiot.
The Idiot, that's right. Who's going to live that way? You got to be some kind of idiot to be that transparent, that's vulnerable, because people are going to hurt you. And yet, that living that way transforms everyone around you. There's a power that lives that way that most of us think is idiocy, to be that transparent. to be that inspirational. We think control is smart, and to be vulnerable is idiocy. And Jesus says, if you're going to surrender that false self and follow me, there's a more powerful way to live. So in psychology, we think we're surrendering that false self, which we also believe, like Jesus, is the way to be more transformational. The way to transform yourself and other people is to live, to take that false self down and have the capacity for going back to that true self, which is more vulnerable. The true self way back when. And our one theory is that we're longing for to take down our false self. All of us are really longing to take down this false self and to be safe enough or courageous enough to be vulnerable with other people so that we can go back and heal what went wrong, basically. So we all long to what we say in psychology is regress. I wish I could go back to that place when I believed in people, when I thought people were good, and now I don't, when I was courageous enough. And you see kids are so vulnerable, they'll just say what they feel. They run around and they're looking for fun and they're just so transparent. I want to go back to that, where I could really be the real me. We call that regression, the longing to go back to that place where I could be my true self, which is why some of you are so immature at times. So by the way, I want to tell you that, because you long to go back there. And if you go back to see your parents, if they're still alive, you regress. You start acting like you did back then. Why you're doing that? It's a longing to go back to my true self. So we know we have this big false self that navigates through life, that it has its utility, but there's something inside of us that longs to surrender that false self to find true self authenticity. So when we surrender, that's what we're really surrendering. The ego, the false self, the selfishness, part of us that we need to get through life, but we really wish we didn't need. I wish I could be that genuine and surrender that. The surrender is opposite of control. Whoever tries to keep their life, they'll lose it. And whoever loses their life, they'll preserve it. That makes a lot of sense psychologically when you think about this. Those of us who want to keep this, defense, ego, keep it. I want to keep that. You're losing out. You're not going to be intimate, right? But if I can surrender that, I can find the kind of vulnerability that leads to intimacy and expands your life so much more. I'm talking about all relationships, not just marriage. I'm talking about a way of being. So the submission is in this submission is in the service of control. Surrender is in the service of authority, right? So if I have relationships where I talk about psychological distinction, where I need someone to submit to me or I need to submit to someone else, it's really a substitution for this longing for surrender. So some of us get these relationships, these controlling relationships, because that's all we know. That's as close as we can get to this. We all have this longing for surrender. We have this longing to be a true self, to be vulnerable. I really want to be Prince Michigan. I want people to be transformed by me being me. And I want to be transformed by that. We all long for that. I'll say because you're created in the image of God. The psychologists don't say that. I'm telling you that. Mm-hmm. So it's ontological. You long to live this way, but many of us have never even experienced that. So this is all we know. So if all you knew was a controlling parent, all you knew was controlling teachers, all you knew was controlling people, it seems like it's surrender. I'm giving over to something. But it isn't. So some of us get stuck in these controlling relationships because that's all we know. It's a substitute for what we long for, to be vulnerable, to be a true self, to be powerful in this way. And I've never known it, so this is what we do. And we control others thinking that that's the loving thing to do. So the people who are controlling think that's right. That's all I know. I'm loving because that's what we do. I'll do it for you. I'll tell you how to live. I'll control you. And then they miss out on anything that's going on over here. So you have to know both. You have to know both. You have to understand the difference between the two. So surrender is something that we mutually do in the presence or out of reverence for Christ. So I'm surrendering to is God. This is the way I want to live, not surrendering to you. I'm living this way because God wants me to live this way, a transparent way. Submission is to a person. psychological distinction. You know, I'm going to give up authority to you. I'm going to give control over to you, or I'll control you because this is based on the longing for this, but never having had it. This is the closest we can get. And we see, you know this, and probably you have people who are in relationships where one of the two is dominating the other person. And you think, why do you stay? Why do you stay? Because of this. Because they that's all they know. They think, well, this is the way to live. This is how you do love. This is how you do love, right? What was the joke again you showed me? To people in marriage counseling, and the counselor says, do you find your wife controlling? And she answers, no, he doesn't. No, I don't know why you showed me that. But I thought, well, that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
Thank you. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. We'll say surrender. You're surrendering to God in the presence of other people. You're not surrendering to the person. Submission is to a person, surrender is to God. So the ultimate goal of surrender is for you to figure out who you are. That's why you're living that way. So you can be that transparent person who empowers other people. It's not domination and control. It's the opposite of that. It's the opposite of submission as a puppet or control of the other as a puppet. This is acceptance. This is resignation. This is vulnerability. This is passivity. This is true self. This is false self. They can look alike. You can get them confused. When you look at someone you don't know, Prince Michigan, we think is an idiot, right? That's the title of the book. And then we find out he's the most powerful person in the whole story. All right, let me give you an example. Sabrina was in her second marriage. She was raised with a very controlling and verbally abusive mother. That was her issue. So she learned to perform for self-worth. If she kept the house clean, if she didn't cause any trouble, if she did what her mother told her to do, then she was avoiding beatings, literally. So her father was passive and he didn't protect her. So she ended up believing this is all there is, right? You just got to make sure you do everything right to avoid getting punished or literally beaten. Her mother, after she beat her one time, said, "Look what you made me do. You know, why do you act that way? Look at my hands. Look what you made me do." Her mother's hands were red just for beating her. Look what you made me do. Some of you may have heard them. So she learned to submit out of fear to avoid punishment. That's what she knew. As good as it gets. You know, you just submit to avoid punishment. So very young, she married the first guy who would ask her to get married because you want to get out of there. So who do you think she married? Her mother, of course, right? That's what we do. She's marrying, she's trying to fix her unfinished business, right? So she thinks, well, I'll marry this guy who somehow reminds me of something. Who is it he reminds me of? Seems so familiar, right? So a few years into it and 3 kids later, oh, I married my mother. So he would beat her. And so finally, when the kids were old enough, she left the guy, got out, and now married to a very wealthy man who was at least 20 years older. I think more than that, but at least 20 years older. He was very, very wealthy. He was on his 4th marriage. So they thought, well, maybe he's too tired to keep doing that. So maybe this will work. And as sometimes happens with really wealthy guys, that he really keeps the money apart, right? I mean, really wealthy. He had a Mustang that was worth $5 million. Now, how's that possible? I know. But these guys trade and sell these rare cars, you know. He had a whole warehouse full of them, you know. So it's that level, right? So she owned nothing. She would let her use all his houses and cars and stuff and took her on vacation, but she didn't own anything. Her name wasn't on anything. He'd learned from his previous marriages, you don't do that, right? And she was just happy to be with someone who just seemed to be generous and someone who's too old to beat her, I think. And so maybe this will be a good way to end up the rest of our lives. So he was, as you can imagine, raised by a controlling father who was married several times. So he was doing what he knew. And he believed that buying things for people is a demonstration of your love. she would wonder if he really loved me. And he said, "What are you talking about? Look at your life. Look around you. Look what I provide for you. What are you talking about?" They both only knew submission as a way to relate. He knew if he provided her things, she should appreciate that and she should love him because he provided her stuff. And then she only knew to submit to whatever he said the rules were, and then that should be enough, right? Well, there was an absence of physical abuse, and so it worked for a few years because, it was better than the previous guy, but something was still missing. There was a surrender, a transformational kind of love, an intimacy that was missing. She didn't know that what she really longed for is not the reason she married the guy. She married him for security. She didn't marry him for intimacy. And then after a few years, she realized, oops, I wanted something more. Do I have security financially? Yeah. Do I have what I really want in life? This thing that I long for? No. So she was working that through. She didn't even understand what was wrong until in the process of therapy, we kind of clarified that. She said to me one day, "I feel so awful." And I said, "Okay, why?" She said, "Because I really can't get what I need in this marriage." I said, "That sounds sad." She says, "Actually, I believe he thinks he loves me. I think that. He takes me on vacations and provides a good living for me and everything, but it never feels like it's for me. It always feels like I'm some kind of ornament for him, like another one of his expensive objects that he controls to make himself feel better." I said, "That must feel lonely." And she said, "Well, that's the point. I'm with him and I'm doing all these things that he wants to do, but I don't feel like he ever understands what I need." Like the cruise we just took, an expensive, all expenses paid cruise for me and his daughter, but it never occurred to him to think of asking if one of my kids would like to join us. When I bring it up, he just says, "Well, that's not my responsibility." That hurts. That really hurts. You see, loving someone is not the same thing as making them feel loved. It's not the same thing. I think from his own perspective, he did feel like he loved her, and it really hurt him that she didn't appreciate him. He was genuinely hurt. "Look at all I do for you." He literally, when she was telling him I'm leaving, he cried. And he said, I just think it's never enough for you. It's just never enough." And the truth was, it isn't. That's right. What you're giving over me over here isn't enough. I want this over here. And they didn't even have the language to talk about that. I really want something that's more powerful than just being able to control objects in your life, because I feel like one of those objects. This is transactional. This is transformational. And when she left, she ended up just saying he doesn't get it. That's the best she could say. She tried to explain it to him, and he really didn't have the template, or this was really all he knew. And he did a lot of good and gave a lot of money to a lot of things, a lot of good work. This is all good stuff. This is not bad. It's not bad to be rich. I'd like a $5 million Mustang. I mean, I would. My brother had one. I never got one, and I really want one. So it's not a bad thing, but it's not everything. You need to know when this is needed. The context for this kind of power is needed, and the context for this kind of power is needed. When there's a transformational longing to surrender to something, mutually surrender to something bigger than us that makes us bigger than who we could ever be without it. So substituting submission for surrender, it resulted in another divorce for her husband. He ended up, the marriage ended up not working because he couldn't, and really because he was afraid, I think. He was afraid to look at himself and say, "You know what, you're doing it, what you've done is good, but you're doing it all wrong in your marriage. The rules of work don't work at home." And he couldn't make that transition. And so I don't know if he's on his fifth marriage or there'll be his sixth marriage or not, but he's certainly not with Sabrina anymore. So most of us in the West can't really understand this concept of surrender. Surrender, we think, means defeat, means giving up. No, that's over here. That's submission. Surrender is something else. It's not giving up. It's surrendering the false self to be a true self. It's being vulnerable so I can have authority in the lives of other people. And actually, this doesn't always just feel good over here. It feels vulnerable and it feels hopeful. But here's a trick about hope, if you actually have hope, it means that there's something to dread that's nearby. So hope and dread are two sides of the same coin, right? Why do you hope? It's because there's something that you dread. There's something to be afraid of. There's something that scares you. That's why we hope, right? And when you're dreading the most, when you're in circumstances that are most awful, that's when you need hope the most, right? So hope and dread are two sides of the same coin. So if you're living over here a more hopeful life, that means you're really aware of the things that can hurt you. You're really aware of the things that we say you should dread in life. So this way of living is not really for the faint of heart, because you can get hurt. Jesus got crucified living this way. He's saying, "Follow me." Well. Paul said, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." A living sacrifice. If you live this way, you're going to get hurt. If you live this way, you're going to get hurt. But you live this way because it's better. I'm willing to be vulnerable in my relationships and with other people because it's a way to get to the true self of me, because I want to live that way. Not because I get to dominate or control you. Doesn't mean you're going to get your way all the time either. Doesn't mean the influence people are going to even take it. You might try to be influential and they don't listen, right? But you're doing that because that's the way you want to live. I want to be a more transparent, vulnerable person because it's good for me to live that way. I offer my body as a living sacrifice. Now, in the church, we have a long history of confusing these two things: control and submission and surrender. We confuse those a lot. We think that by giving up everything and sacrificing ourselves, that's what surrender is. So we used to have in the first century, we had what we called pillar saints. These were Christians that believe they need to be ascetic. They need to give up everything physical. So they would live on top of pillars, and people would throw food up to them. They were the true saints. We are the real Christians because we've given everything up, right? Well, no, you've just given up control. You don't understand this. This is surrendering to God. It's not giving up stuff. It's surrendering your false self to God. It's not being ascetic. It's not being anti-material. And sometimes in the church, we think we should be anti-materialistic. That's spiritual. Well, no, that's not right. It's this surrendering to God in our relationships and living vulnerably. So I'm not opposed to people being successful at what they do. But in the church, we think that if I'm self-sacrificing, that's really spiritual. And what we call that in psychology is masochistic. If I suffer enough, then I'll know I'm a good person. And so we have these sadomasochistic relationships. I'm not just talking about sex, I'm talking about relationships, right? Where one person needs to be hurtful and the other person needs to get hurt, right? And you think those are the ones where you scratch your head and say, why are you staying with that guy? Why would you stay with? Well, it's this, where they're longing to surrender. They don't know that, so then they submit. And the guy who's controlling, I'll say guy, but it can be a wife too. The guy who's controlling thinks that's the most loving thing to do. Well, I know the right way to do things. I'm going to keep you in line, right? And control you. And the suffering person, this is really true usually in the masochistic relationships where you think all you know is submission. You think if I suffer enough, God will be pleased with me. Look how good I am. Look at what a good person I am, because look what I put up with. I must be a good person. Somehow they believe it in the back of their mind. Well, I don't do what he does. What he does is bad. What I do, well, look how spiritual I am. So the church, we've misunderstood that. We have a long history of misunderstanding submission and surrender. It's in there. I mean, the Bible explains it. We just have to have the eyes to see it. You're surrendering to God to live a transparent life, not just giving up stuff, like giving up your power, giving up control. That's not the same thing. Alice, please. We always learn something.
This is kind of embarrassing, but So I have a spiritual director that I admire, and she's really helped me a lot. And she gives these classes, and in class, she doesn't believe in giving out the paperwork that she reads from, so we always have to take notes, and she goes fast, and we have to go, could you repeat, and I was
Like
tired,
me.
plus we're,
Yeah.
well, yeah.
Yeah.
But, so we're paying for this class, right? So during my time with her, I told her, I'm like, how about if you just kind of type it up for us,
Mhm.
And she said, no, I don't do that. So, if you don't want to take notes, that's fine. You don't have to. And, she was like, so I got mad. And I said, but we're paying for this class. It's not like we're coming for a book club. So, and she stood firm with what she believed in.
Yeah.
Which made me even angrier,
Mhm.
And so now she got angry because when I get angry, I say things I shouldn't be saying, and then blah, blah, blah. And so it escalated and blah, blah. So finally she said, she said, well, we don't even have to continue. I don't have to be your spiritual director if you feel this, whatever you said to me, blah, blah, blah,
Right.
which hurt me because she's very good. What happened in the middle of that whole thing,
Mhm.
she said something that very quietly, she said, Alice, you seem to do this historically about, like leaving when, it's a long story, but she said something
Yeah.
that triggered something in me like, wait a minute, let me get off this wheel we're on
Mhm.
and see what the hell she's talking about.
Right.
And at that point, I think is where I took my ego or my righteousness.
Yeah.
And I'm like, let's put that aside for a second, because this looks important.
Yes.
And so then I asked her more about it, and the more she explained it to me, I humbly realized that I was doing something that historically had nothing to do with her, but it was something, whatever. And so I thought, oh my God, this woman pointed something in me that needs to be healed. This is something I have been doing. So I had to remove myself from this situation that I felt I was right about, and I still do today.
Yeah.
To that something she said
Yes.
that really transformed me at that time. But I was struggling because I had this going that I was righteous, and why should I believe her? And the other little voice saying, but she's right.
Mhm.
Driving home, thank God she lives in Upland and live in Pasadena. So it took me a while to get home, and I kept going over and over and over. And finally I thought, I need to separate
Mhm.
my righteous way. I'm still gonna tell her she needs to make copies. I need to acknowledge that this woman is like a prophet.
Mhm.
She came up, so we can be both. We can be irritating and
Yep.
whatever, and at the same time.
Got it.
And I think that's what I'm getting
Yep.
from you, is like we're healers, even that's what the healing part is. And even in that marriage, I love that because he married her and he did the same thing she was doing, because he was like saying, if I buy her all kinds of stuff, she won't ask me for anything more.
Right.
And she did the same thing. She's
Yeah.
like, well, if I do all this, then I'll be left alone. And so they would never come together. So, oh my God, so that was profound for me. When you said that, it just triggered that,
That's exactly what I'm talking about. That was you denying your false self, which is, necessary. Like she probably should type up those handouts, so the false self got you to fight for that, right? But you could surrender to God, not to her. And you could say, what do I need to learn, God? Is there something I need to learn here? It's a beautiful example of exactly what I'm saying. So you were confident enough in your relationship with God to surrender this to experience the transformation that can happen there. It only happens in that way. When we realize, oh, there's something I need to learn here. She needed to learn something, and we're all clear about that. If we voted, we'll all vote. That's clear. What wasn't clear is what you needed. And that's the only way we can get there, is by surrendering not to the person, to God. To submit to people, you surrender to God. Yes.
Now, when you're talking about surrender, or you're talking about your relationship with God and the submissionness with another person, but what is it when it's chronic pain that you're having to live with? Someone who really has the most intense chronic pain, and how the question is, God, what do you want me to learn here? Or how does that apply, or does it apply?
It's a very interesting question, because what we found is that happiness is a self-report. So that means the only way we can know how happy you are is to ask you, and then you tell me. There's a scale of 1 to 10, you tell me how happy you are. I can't tell you, you tell me. So it's a subjective self-experience. And what we found is that even people with chronic pain habituate, they figure out how to live with that pain, and they report as much happiness as the general population. Now, how's that possible? How's that possible? Because there's a difference between pain and suffering, right? Pain is we feel it, you can even measure it. Your doctor probably asks you, scale of 1 to 10, where we measure it. That's pain. Suffering is what it means to us to be in pain, right? So oftentimes, well, that's what we find, people who have chronic pain or people who are disabled, Nick Vujicic, you know, Nick, the guy who doesn't have any arms and any legs at all. He's an inspirational speaker, goes around the country, yeah, giving lectures about how happy he is. No arms and no legs. He comes, there's a little appendage that he drives his wheelchair in. Comes in, jumps up in lectures. He says, I've got no arms and no legs, and I thank God every day of my life. What's your excuse? No, I know, it's like humbling to hear this. So my point is this, that people figure out the difference between pain and suffering. We have the capacity to make meaning out of our lives. And there are people who live with chronic pain who figure that out. Now, not everyone does. There are people who resent it, and every day it's why God, why me? And those people suffer as well as are in pain. And then there are people who somehow figure out the difference. They live with chronic pain and don't suffer in the same way. So, and I can't really tell you how. Something like this here, right? Where they realize that this can't be controlled, so that's not going to work. I can't control the people who specialize in pain management sometimes can't do it, right? So what I have to figure out is how to surrender to God and experience transformation, even though I can't control. I can't control the situation. And I don't mean to trivialize that at all. There's a very, very, very difficult path in life for people to live. And Nick has had a big impact on me. I remember hearing him give a lecture. Johnny and Friends, you know who that is? It's a disability ministry. They provide wheelchairs to people who need wheelchairs around the country. And I was doing a workshop there, and he was the key speaker. And I remember this years ago, Nick, wheelchair, jumps up on a podium, gives his lecture, and said this, I just said to you. And I remember him saying in that lecture, he said, I just want you guys to pray with me because I'm praying every day for my wife. I know she's out there, and I can't wait to meet her. You know? What a gutsy guy. So I follow him. He's married, has 2 kids today.
Wow.
A beautiful woman, absolutely stunningly gorgeous woman, and has 2 normal kids. So this was some deformity that happened in the room for him. Who does that?
Yeah.
So that's an example of someone who's surrendered, right? And he couldn't, there's no way he could control the circumstances. No way he could control. So I'm not even going to try, but I can surrender to God and wait for the transformation to happen. He's such a transformational person that people wanted to be around. A woman wanted to marry him and have kids with him because he was so transformational. That's power, right? And he had almost no control. No control. I love it, story. And admire his courage for living that way. You think it's easy to live that way? No. When he came to my workshop, and because I was talking about the power struggles in marriage, because he wanted to help his parents because they keep fighting all the time. Can you imagine how difficult it was to raise a kid like that? You know, it probably was tough on them. Parents have been fighting. So we dominate out of fear, and we surrender motivated by love. So I want to control and dominate really because I'm afraid. I'm usually afraid to be vulnerable. And I'm able to surrender to God and live this more vulnerable, transformational way because I love God. I love life. I love others. And it's not easy. Nick's life is not easy. And I can imagine how difficult his life is. It's better. Better because he has this way of surrendering to God, not to other people, and certainly not to his circumstance. Last week we were talking about the difference between love and hate. And someone came up afterwards and said, I said that fear is the opposite of love. It's not hate. Hate's not the opposite of love. You can love someone and hate them. at the same time, it's called marriage, and yet it goes up and down, because you're passionate, right? You're passionate. How many movies are made about the couple fighting the whole movie and then they get together at the end? It's like this tension, this passion is not that far away from love. And some people have said that really no, indifference is the opposite of love. Well, indifference is the absence of love, not the opposite of love. So if afterwards you figure out that he's just indifferent, it means he doesn't love you anymore, right? It means the love's gone. But fear is actively opposing love. See, someone who's indifferent, just there's an absence of love. But someone who's afraid to be vulnerable, they're actively thwarting it. They're actively thwarting love. That's why the Bible says there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Because fear has to do with punishment. And the one who fears is not perfect in love. So fear is the enemy of love. And indifference is just the absence of love. So if both are a problem, you need to know what to do when that happens. But anger is not necessarily a bad thing in a love relationship. See, there are two kinds of anger in intimate relationships, not just marriage, but just close relationships. There's the anger of hope and the anger of despair. There's two kinds of anger. The anger of despair is I give up. It's like, I'm out, it's over, I'm mad, I don't like you. And so it's very destructive, right? The anger of despair. Anger of hope says, we can be better than this. I'm mad because I know we can be better. This is not good enough. And I'm going to fight to make this better. So you hang in there and the anger motivates you to solve the problem. Anger is energy to solve a problem. So anger in a relationship with a friend, in a church setting, in a marriage is not necessarily a bad thing. You just got to figure out which kind it is. Is your anger destructive or is it constructive? Are you trying to fix something or trying to break it? What kind of anger do you have?
That's a real important distinction.
Right. What are you trying to do here with your anger? Let's just answer that. And sometimes I'll say to people, are we having a conversation here or are you just yelling? Because if it's just yelling, there's no conversation. It's over. You don't want to talk? It's fine. But let's stop doing this. This is not constructive. So yeah, there's a time to call time out. Right? And you should know this, that the way the brain works physically, the prefrontal cortex is where you think, and the amygdala is where you feel. It's in the middle of the brain. The amygdala here, the prefrontal cortex is up here. There's a time when the amygdala hijacks the prefrontal cortex. You can get so angry that you can't think straight. Now you're saying stuff that you don't even mean, because this part, we call it flipping your lid, it's all amygdala. It's all amygdala. You're just, the lizard brain, it's just like, when the amygdala has hijacked the prefrontal cortex, that's not constructive. Let's call time out. And there's a time to now what you don't say is, I can't talk to you, and you walk out. That's not helpful. You say, I'm not dealing with this very well. I need 30 minutes. I'll be back in 30 minutes. Or you say, I'll be back in an hour. So we'll talk tomorrow. If you're the person who feels like you're flipping your lid, you give them the time you're going to come back. You can't just bail on the conversation. That's abandonment. And they're going to chase you. You say, I can't talk to you. You walk out. Well, they chase you around. You go to the bathroom, lock the door. They're pounding on the door. We're not done with this conversation. Of course you're not. I know we're not. So you say, I'm not dealing with this very well. I need to talk to you at 5. We'll talk at 5 when we're both calmed down. You need to get the cortisol levels down so you can have an intelligent conversation with the prefrontal cortex engaged. You want your thinking part of your brain engaged when you're having a confrontation. So anger is not bad. Anger is not a sin. The Bible says, in your anger, do not sin. It doesn't say anger is a sin. If anger is a sin, then Jesus sinned. So that can't be, right? But you need to manage your anger, because if you don't, it can be very destructive. All right, kind of out of time, but does anybody have a question that they want to ask or a story you want to tell that I can use? I'm going to use Alice's story. That's a great story. Yes.
Can you tell us a little about Anne, the story you didn't get to last time?
Oh, the perfectionist.
That's a long story. Yeah, I'll do that next. I'll bring it up next time. I'll tell you about perfectionism.
Perfect time.
That'll be the perfect. Next, I'll tell you about Ian next time. To do it justice.
Okay, good.
Oh,
Thanks.
justice.
Oh, nice.
Anything else? Yes.
Yeah, I think that what you said, that you marry or you're in relationship without work or wherever, with the person that's gonna help you
Yes.
heal. I've also heard that you marry or in relationship with a person that resembles the parent that hurt you the most.
Yes, it's very similar because they're the one you have the most unfinished business with. Right, so you find yourself drawn toward this, something familiar. It's like, I know this person, right? All right, yeah. They're the person that had the biggest impact on me. Sometimes that means they're the one who hurt you the most. So we find ourselves drawn into, because we want to perfect ourselves. We're trying to finish our unfinished business by being drawn to someone who reminds us of some piece of unfinished business for us. And oftentimes that's with a hurtful parent. That was with Harville Hendricks, his whole thing. That's why he was on Oprah 17 times. Is because that's what his message is. Of course you fight, that you're drawn to the person that makes you the most angry on the planet, person you have unfinished business with. But his thesis is never divorce. His thesis is he's a Baptist minister. And his thesis is hang in there and learn what you need to learn. Get it right this time. That's his thesis. I think sometimes we make a mistake.
I love the rich guy, girl who was in abusive relationships. You were pretty general about he gave stuff, but what did he not specifically give her? Was it affection? Was it understanding? Was it being on the same plane, or was he always above her? I mean, what?
It was always above her. It was always controlling. It was his way. They went on vacation. They would take one of his kids, never one of her kids. What he didn't give her was vulnerability. He was never vulnerable. He was never, you know what? I can see you're hurt that I didn't invite you or my child. And I feel bad about that. He could never say that. Never say I'm sorry. He could never realize that she would have emotional needs and feelings. It was all physical for him. I'm paying for this. Why don't you appreciate me? And he was genuinely hurt that she didn't appreciate the life he gave her. Well, she did, but it wasn't enough. That's why he kept saying, it's never enough for you. And her answer was, that's right. It isn't enough. I need you to be vulnerable. I don't need your treasures. I need to be treasured. And that's what was missing. She didn't feel treasured. She felt like she was just another expensive object in this very expensive house.
But on the flip side, I think that it was nothing would have been ever enough for her.
Well,
So I see her fault as well.
yes, well, she didn't know. She didn't know what she needed. They married, they only knew submission, so they married under those terms. But she outgrew it. She realized once she did get a guy who wasn't abusive and he was generous and he loved her in the way that she wanted to be loved, which is to give her stuff, she realized it wasn't enough. But she didn't know that until she got in it. You're right. She changed the deal. It's not his fault. It's her fault that she outgrew it.
Yeah.
It's
I
like,
mean, I see her fault more than his.
well, you could say it fault. If you want to say fault, yeah, because she outgrew it. She realized, oh, I'm sorry, we made this deal and now I want to break the deal.
Yeah.
It was, you're gonna give me stuff and I'm gonna give you whatever you ask for, and then we'll both be happy. And then she realized that wasn't enough. But she didn't know it when they got married. It's true. She outgrew it. And so he's looking.
Growing is a real thing.
It's a real thing, yeah, and it creates problems. Yeah, and you're gonna have friends who resent you. When you outgrow it and they go, what are you doing? You've changed.
And you realize maybe that there aren't conversations that can be had.
Creates problems. I mean, if you're really growing, yeah, you're gonna have some friendships that fall off because now I want to live this way. I want to be more transparent, and they don't. And so then they're trying to pull you back, or your family will try to pull you back into the family system. Well, no, this is how we are. We live this way, not this way.
That's like the movie Banshee of Inisherin.
I haven't seen it
Have you
yet.
seen that?
No,
Oh, I would love for you to see that. Is exactly what you're talking about. It's one of the big award winners coming up, nominees, and
what's it called?
Banshees of Inisherin. It's like a
Oh,
make-believe
Have you seen that?
Irish. It's Irish.
Oh, yeah, I think I've seen it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so good. I mean, this is.
Oh, right. Oh, that's with Colin.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have seen that. Yeah.
In Ireland, and
They're trying to pull him back into the way it was. Yeah.
I don't want to give it away for people who might see it, but it would be a perfect movie for you to see. Everything you're talking about. It's
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah.
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 I'm not trying to make it sound like this is easy to do this. No.
Wait till you see what happens in the movie. You'll see.
Yeah. We did see. I didn't remember the name of it. I would say it's.
Mark, this,
Yeah, Jody.
I think it's something that has alive over the years.
Yeah.
Which is fine. Enormous corporation. And there are people with authority.
Yep.
And there are people with power.
Yep.
And they're not always the same person.
Correct.
And so learning the distinction between having authority and having power, which is influential power, the power to influence.
Mhm.
And recognizing when you are submitting to authority versus surrendering to
Control.
power
Mhm.
is something that goes on daily.
Yeah.
I don't know that we've tried over the years to put words to it, you know, there's the lightning of power, I don't know, there's little tiny books that come out.
Yeah.
Corporate versions of self-help books are usually very superficial. But
No, they've studied, organizational psychologists have studied that, you know, the people,
But yeah, and it influences how a large corporation.
right,
And
there are people who have structural power because that they have the title for it. And there are
Yes.
people who are influential in the organization,
Right.
so they have unofficial authority to influence
Yeah.
people.
And the largest challenge that a person has. When they're in a position where what they do makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Is how to deal with the authority that is not exactly on the same page as what is necessary. And so, you know, how do you stand up to authority and power? Without causing detrimental conflict.
It's a really important question in that organization and in society as well.
Yeah.
You know, how do we speak truth to power, you know, I mean, in a constructive way? What's constructive? And we're trying to figure that out because we're in a mess.
And what's not divisive.
Even what's not divisive. Is this helpful? You know, we're gonna ask that question
Is this helpful?
of our society.
There's this big lawsuit, you know, this big thing's been going on for a lot of crashes. And if you read between the lines of what's being reported, you can see this dynamic.
Yeah,
You can
right.
See the dynamic of people who had authority, but didn't necessarily understand what their authority was doing. People who had the power to do something, but were trying to respond to authority instead. And you know, it's just, this is
We're all engaged in some version of a power struggle all the time, some version, more or less, and certainly in organizations and corporations and leadership. It's really important for leadership to understand this distinction too. Because what do we want to do? Do we want to have transactions or do we want to be transformational? And leaders need to understand those differences too. Okay, I'm going to stop for now. I've got some books over here and a recording of last week's session if you didn't get it. And I'll be back again next week. So, see you then.